Welcome to the first Green Book Pod, produced in association with Lib Dem Podcast. Our aim in this series is to explore the major challenges facing the country after the next election, and to discuss what the Liberal Democrat response could be. We'll be featuring both external experts and party insiders. My name is Duncan Brack, and I'm part of the team producing this series. We're calling it the Green Book Pod after the publication we launched 10 years ago. The Green Book, New Directions for Liberals in Government, published in 2013, featured contributions from both Liberal Democrats, ministers, parliamentarians, councillors and activists, and people outside the party. We aim to contribute to the debate about the challenges facing the next Parliament and the need for innovative green solutions that the Liberal Democrats could adopt. 10 years on, the political context is obviously very different. Britain's exit from the EU, the accelerating climate emergency, growing inequality, crumbling public services, the rise of populism, and much else. Our belief remains, however, that there is a massive opportunity for the Liberal Democrats to set out an agenda for making a real difference, but only by identifying innovative, radical, and robust solutions with realistic strategies to deliver them. So that's the aim behind this podcast series. In November, we'll consider the challenges of reaching net zero, and in December, the question of the Liberal Democrats' position on Europe. But now I'll hand over to my colleague Robin Stafford to introduce the first in the series on the economic challenges facing the country. Robin, over to you.
Thank you, Duncan, and welcome to today's podcast on the subject of economic policy. We're all well aware of the state of our public services and infrastructure and the poor productivity of the wider economy, and that this is driven by a lack of investment in the country, both public and private. The standard answer has been, but there is no money, which has been the excuse for the austerity of the last 13 years, which has only made things worse. So we want to explore today, is there a better way, a different approach and a different narrative? And we'll look at what has been done differently elsewhere, in particular in the USA, and then ask where the money might come from. We're very pleased today to have three experts to help us. Vicky Pryce, who's a well-known economics commentator. She's the Chief Economic Advisor at the Centre for Economics and Business Research, visiting professor at King's College, and was joint head of the government's economic service. She's frequently called in to comment by the news channels and in the media. Max von Thun was the economic advisor to the party when Vince Cable was leader. He's now the Europe director for the Open Markets Institute, who are a think tank raising awareness of the dangers from economic concentration in key industries and supply chains, whilst promoting policies to bring a more open and diverse economy. He brings good insights in particular into what's happening in the US with what people refer to as Bidenomics and the so-called Inflation Reduction Act that's seeing big investments in industry, infrastructure and renewables. Richard Murphy is a chartered accountant and political economist who's now a professor of accounting practice at Sheffield University Management School. He was one of the creators of the original Green New Deal and also the tax justice movement, and is an active blogger on political economy. And I'm Robin Stafford, and I've been supporting the party's parliamentary group on economic matters over the last 5 to 6 years. So to start with, we should just briefly ask the question, well, where are we and why, without getting ourselves too depressed? So Vicky, could I ask you to kick off, please? What do you see as the big challenges we have to face, and what's got us into this state without getting us too depressed?
I think the general issue, of course, is that we are still quite an open economy and there is a lot going on around us. So what's happening globally matters hugely. The fact that we have had, of course, the financial crisis, after that, very little growth in the economy, austerity for a period. And then just as we were beginning to perhaps recover, we had the Brexit referendum and investment suffered. What we've seen since, of course, has been the COVID pandemic and then the energy crisis with the war in Ukraine. So it hasn't been an easy environment for industry anyway to cope with all these things that have been going on. But what's happening now, of course, is that we are facing very low productivity over a period of time. Industry is finding itself slightly isolated from other bits that they were quite used to, such as Europe. There are concerns about exporting and importing and the cost that all this has added to the economy. And we have also had so many frequent, changes and more frequent recently in leadership, in the sense that although it has, of course, been a Conservative-led government for quite some time now, 13 years, the last 5 years or so have seen so many changes in who runs the country. So we had different PMs, we've had different chancellors, and this instability and uncertainty that it has created for business has left a real mark. I think in terms of investment intentions in particular, the small and medium-sized enterprises have also suffered, and the entire environment, if you look at the way in which competition has developed and regulation is not quite caught up with it, has meant that the big boys have managed to survive. The smaller ones are finding it a lot more difficult. So basing growth on what we've got right now and hoping that somehow or other this growth will emerge in the future is probably in a difficult task that any government is going to have come the next election.
Thank you, Vicky. Richard, I wonder if you wanted to chip in there, and I'm thinking about public investment as much as private investment.
Well, clearly public investment has suffered badly over the last 15 years because of the consequences of the global financial crisis in 2008, already mentioned by Vicky, and of course, austerity. And in a period when there is austerity, the first thing you do is basically cut investment. And some of that is the obvious investment you see identified as such, but a great deal more has in fact also been the maintenance investment, the routine revenue expenditure, which nonetheless keeps your capital stock in good order. So we now have, actually a bit like the USA, frankly, a massive backlog in public spending required to keep our capital stock in good order. And as a consequence, over the last 15 years, we've really failed in very many ways the intergenerational issues which arise in any economy, because those who are now older, I could put myself into that category, I guess, these days, have failed to maintain the capital stock, the public capital stock of this country for the benefit of those who are coming up. This creates, in turn, other significant problems because that backlog has got to be made good. We've seen it. We know that hospitals are literally falling down. One is only 30 miles up the road from me. 1,500 scaffold poles hold up King's Lynn Hospital. And that's quite extraordinary. And this is a problem all over the country. So we have seen this massive failure to understand the need for ongoing investment because of a supposed shortage of funds. That was claimed to be, by the Conservatives, a correction to Labour's policy of not mending the roof when the sun was shining. They claimed that Labour failed to invest before 2008. In fact, it's very obvious that the failure has been under the Conservatives. And at the moment, we are not hearing anything significant about addressing that shortfall in public investment. We're hearing lots of promises. 5 pledges appear to be going around the circuit almost everywhere, but none of those are actually coming with significant price tags attached. And the seemingly unglamorous issue of dealing with failed concrete is not high on anyone's apparent agenda. So we've got real problems, exacerbated by one further issue, which I think we have to throw into the arena at the moment, which is, of course, the whole interest rate scenario has changed. Whereas we had nearly 15 years, well, 13 plus years of net zero interest rates. We were at the zero bound in monetary policy terms. So base interest rates were around 0%, and the real cost of government borrowing was very small indeed. It's now rising, and rising significantly and quite fast, even as we record this podcast. I mean, the rate has been going up quite steadily over the last few months, pushed by continuing fears of inflation. Rightly or wrongly, I personally don't believe that interest rates will correct inflation policy, but that's my personal belief. I don't know whether the other panelists will agree, but that's not the point. Wherever we look at it, it is central bank policy in the UK, in the USA and the ECB, backed by the IMF and others, to keep interest rates high and for a long period of time. We're therefore facing an economy of the sort that we are simply completely unused to, where there might be real positive interest rates. And that's going to have a very harmful effect on investment as well, because business and government are totally unused to this. And the immediate reaction to real positive interest rates is spend less. So we aren't seeing a good environment at present to get out of the mess that we're in, is my opinion.
Can I just sort of link what you've been saying to what Vicky was saying, Vicky coming more from a business perspective, and that is to pick up the phrase of the mantra for a long time has been all about how government expenditure crowds out private expenditure, rather than, and we have it most recently with renewables and the wind farms, that government expenditure leads and stimulates private expenditure. I wonder if you want to comment on that, because we've been through a long period of just leave it to the market. They will make the right decisions and spend the money.
Well, I describe politicians who think that as cowardly politicians. They look at any problem and say, whatever it is, the market will deal with it better than we can, therefore we won't do anything. Yes, Minister, I'm sure would have come up with a slightly different version of that argument, but that's fundamentally what they do. And I'm extremely wary of that for a number of very good reasons. First of all, we literally cannot solve many of the problems we've got without government spending. But secondly, it seems to be that there's a universal case multiplier effects of government spending. This, I think, is a problem that it started in places like the IMF. The Treasury is completely wedded to the idea that multiplier effects almost don't exist. And let's just explain what that means. When the government spends, first of all, a great deal of money comes back to it immediately, because the people they spend it on are not sort of amorphous beings who don't exist in the real world. They're people, by and large, or companies, all of whom will actually be paying tax. So there's an immediate return on expenditure by the government, which can be quite significant. 35 to 40% of the spend comes back very quickly. The remaining 60% left over after the initial tax yield is, of course, spent by those who receive it. They then go on and pay tax on what they receive and so on. If the spending is designed properly, and it's very clear that two areas of government spending have very high multiplier effects. One is the NHS, because it actually puts people back to work and takes them off benefits, and therefore the returns on investment in the NHS are very high in government revenue terms. And the second one is investment, because it actually creates long-term increases in productivity, therefore also boosting the returns to the economy as a whole as a result of government spending. If that's where the spending is focused, then we actually get significant returns. There isn't a black pit, but if you listen to most ministers, particularly from our two leading parties, let's be honest about that, you would think that any amount of government spending is like pouring money into a bottomless hole from which nothing ever emerges. And that's simply untrue. That money is spent with people and businesses, and both of them go on and invest more, save more, do more, spend more, all of which creates new economic activity. So the government is the person who can break the downward economic cycle we have at present. And this is, I mean, I display myself as a Keynesian, I guess, by saying that, but that's the fundamental point here. We don't have to spend forever. But at the moment, we're in a vicious downward cycle, and it is a boost in government spending that can turn the direction around before more revenues come in. It's not long term forever, but it is necessary now. Yes.
Can I just intervene quickly? Because I mean, what Robin asked was, or mentioned, was also offshore wind, I think, if I heard you correctly, and what's happening there. That isn't necessarily, of course, government spending. Remember, whether it's nuclear power, whether it's actually renewables, whether it is of course, which includes, of course, offshore wind. It is the consumer who pays at the end, because it's the private sector that is induced to put the money in terms of investment, because they're guaranteed by the government that the consumer is going to pay a certain amount for many years to come. So it is a different way of intervening in the market, not necessarily spending money, but at the end of the day, it is the consumer who pays. But of course, it benefits particularly businesses which have this guarantee. Look what's going on with nuclear right now, where the costs are escalating. It's not the government that's going to necessarily have to bear those. It is the company that is involved in building the nuclear reactor and the power station, and it is, or rather the power station itself, and it is really the consumer at the end of the day who is going to pay for it. So there are different ways in which the government can intervene to influence investments. Some of them less good than others, if I may say.
Max, from your slightly detached perspective, sitting as I know you are in Brussels, wondered anything you'd want to add to that conversation?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll stick with the UK for now. I mean,
Yes.
Firstly, just to say I agree with everything that Richard and Vicky have said, particularly the impact of austerity, Brexit, and all the political instability we've seen on the economy. But I want to talk to a slightly different issue, although I think it, broadly speaking, comes out of this same viewpoint we were talking about, where basically, governments have said we leave everything to the markets. Markets allocate capital most efficiently, and government can fix failures, but nothing more than that. And I think, what we've seen, not just over the past 15 years, but I would say, more going back 30, 40 years, is a big concentration of power in the UK, of economic power, both in terms of corporate power, but also in terms of kind of individual power and individual wealth. So if you look at corporate concentration, there's research from the CMA that has shown that we've seen rising levels of corporate concentration in the UK economy, where you have a smaller and smaller number of firms who dominate individual markets. That then allows them, for example, to raise prices beyond their own costs, what we call markups. It allows them to prevent rivals from entering the market. And, we also have data which shows that the kind of stickiness of dominant firms in individual sectors has increased over time. And that's been bad in a number of ways. As I said, it prevents new entrants from entering the market. It allows those dominant companies to extract rents from consumers, from businesses, from workers as well. And it means, there's lots of research showing that incumbent firms don't need to innovate or invest as much in concentrated markets as they do in competitive markets. And that overall has an impact on growth and productivity and the things we're talking about here. So that's one side of the concentration issue. And then the other is concentration of income and wealth among individuals, which again, we've seen increasing in the UK. And the UK is a more unequal country than a lot of its European counterparts there. And again, I think that has a kind of wider impact on the economy, both because we know that, wealthier people tend to save more of their income than spend on it. So that has an impact on kind of aggregate demand in the economy. Also, it tends to drive a lot of, you could say, socially useless or even economically harmful activity, financial speculation, consumption of luxury goods and that sort of thing. So I think those two things, have been detrimental for the economy in the longer run. And I think they're also harmful to democracy because they give people the sense that, a small number of companies and people kind of are the ones who benefit from society and everyone else is kind of left outside. And I think that has also fueled a lot of the anger that we've seen in politics.
And to make a political point, if I may, that's a very liberal perspective to be wanting to challenge concentrations of power, whether you be in the private sector or the state, come to that. That's a very liberal perspective that's unhelpful to the wider society and economy. Can we move on then, perhaps, Max, if you want to talk a little bit about what's been happening in the USA, which is very interesting contrast with what people refer to as Bidenomics, well disguised as the Inflation Reduction Act. But underneath it, there are some very different things going on.
Yeah, happy to speak to that. I think worth mentioning that Open Markets is an American think tank. So most of us are based in the US. And so we've been closely involved in a lot of the kind of developments happening there in industrial policy and competition policy. But as you said, I'm based in Brussels, so I'm following more what's happening in the EU. And I can talk a little bit to both. But I think if we start with the US picture, before talking about specific policies, I think it's important to talk just about the big shift in thinking and ideas that we've seen there under the Biden administration. I think people who maybe don't follow what's happening in the US so closely kind of see Biden as some boring old centrist or someone who's just kind of, keeping the ship stable after the Trump disaster. But actually, what we have seen there is something a lot more ambitious, which I would describe as overall a reevaluation of the previous economic paradigm. You can call it neoliberalism, you can call it whatever you like, but basically of the idea that, as we were talking about before, markets know best, and that the state should, overall stay out and just correct market failures. That corporations should be allowed to grow as big as they like, because that's more efficient. That, it's good economic policy to concentrate all your manufacturing capacity in sort of one or two places, as long as that's cheaper for consumers. And, the idea that your problems will be solved because of trickle-down economics. And so you don't need to worry about the structure of the market or the structure of income and wealth, because, those will kind of take care of themselves. And there's been a big reevaluation that because of a number of things. I mean, we had the financial crisis, which obviously harmed the idea that financial markets can be trusted to behave rationally and allocate capital in the right way. But then more recently, we've had COVID, we've had the Ukraine war, and all the supply chain crises which have come out of that, which have made countries again think a lot more about not only how cheap things cost to produce, but where they're produced, and have just created more of a focus on issues like resilience and fairness rather than just efficiency. And so if you look at the US, I think this reevaluation is happening in a number of policy areas. It's happening in competition policy, which we work on most closely. So for a long time, there was very little competition enforcement in the US because the idea was that you could allow firms to grow as big as you want, you can allow mergers to take place. That's going to be good for consumers, and we don't need to worry about the bigness of companies per se. That's definitely changing under people like Lina Khan and Jonathan Cantor, who are now in charge of antitrust enforcement in the US. But you're also seeing it in trade policy, where the administration is thinking about, again, not just how we can get goods produced most cheaply, but also things like, again, resilience, but also labor standards. What are the environmental conditions that things are being produced in? You're also seeing it in labor policy, where the administration have been, for example, including provisions on unionized labor in some of their industrial policy work. They've been trying to strengthen the role of collective bargaining, and you even had President Biden turning up at the picket line recently with auto workers who are pushing for a better pay deal in the US, which is pretty historically unprecedented. And you've also seen it in kind of changing rhetoric. So you've had Jake Sullivan, for example, the National Security Advisor, talking about a new Washington consensus. And President Biden, when he talks about Bidenomics, he talks about empowering workers, fair competition, and smart public investment being part of his overall economic program. So that is really miles away from anything that we've seen in recent US politics. It's very far away from, for example, President Obama's approach to economic policy, even though Biden was his vice president. So there's a big shift there. I think we also see it in the EU to a slightly lesser extent. The EU is talking more now about strategic autonomy and digital sovereignty and all these kind of catchwords, which are really about, again, promoting, resilience and domestic capacity, and not just kind of trusting, global markets and companies to take care of the economy. So I think in practical terms, we're seeing a similar direction of travel in the EU. A lot more spending on industrial policy, on green technology, on bringing semiconductors back on shore. Although I think there's less of an explicit rejection of the previous orthodoxy than what we're seeing in the US. And I think just to give a few more examples, concrete examples of the types of initiatives that we're seeing in the US. So Robin, you were mentioning the Inflation Reduction Act, which is essentially, the name is a little bit misleading. It's essentially a big industrial policy program to use public investment to drive the green transition, and also ensure that investment benefits American workers and left behind parts of the country. Similar with the US CHIPS Act, which is trying to do something similar for semiconductors. You've seen a lot more aggressive antitrust enforcement, which I was alluding to, but you've seen the antitrust regulators trying, not always successfully, to block big mergers in the technology sector, in pharmaceuticals, and in other areas where there's a lot of concentration, and where I think there's a strong case that further concentration would be harmful. You've seen things like attempts to ban non-compete clauses, which are a big problem in the US, which prevent people from moving between employers, and which these days, even cover people working for fast food restaurants and things like that, where it's clearly just there to push down wages. And that you're also seeing coordination between the EU and the US on these things. So you're seeing joint work, for example, on competition and on these supply chain issues. Although that is also creating some friction, because when governments are trying to subsidize their own industries, that creates anxiety on the part of the other actors who are worried about investment, sort of choosing the US rather than the EU. And so that has created some friction, which I think we're still working to resolve. But yeah, I think the overall message is there's a big shift in economic thinking, and also in policy, which is just beginning to play out.
And it is such a profound shift, as you said, in underlying economic thinking. On the tangible surface side is we're seeing these massive new investments, as you said, industrial policy. And I have a sort of first-hand view. I have a son who works in Detroit, working very closely with Ford at senior levels, where we're seeing huge new factories being built in interesting places like Tennessee and Kentucky, which is the state's equivalent of the northeast of England, if you like. So this is having a real tangible effect. I wonder, Richard and Vicky, would you add to that or question that?
Well, I mean, the main thing is, where does it leave the UK? If we're thinking about policies, I mean, it is true that I mean, the US has the power to do what it wants to do, even though I think the debt ceiling that they have to deal with every now and then sort of puts a bit of a question mark as to how much they will be able to do even in the coming years, and certainly before the next election in the US, which is a worry. But yes, I think Europe is moving ahead and has the power to do so, perhaps not quite as effectively as perhaps the US is doing, but they're getting some sort of compromise to make various allowances for various companies to still have access to the US and for exports, but also getting some of those investment grants, if you like. But at the end of the day, I think we are going to see the UK being quite isolated if it doesn't get itself aligned with both camps, really, because we simply don't have the power. And I think what Richard was saying before, of course, it's absolutely true that we can spend more, possibly also borrow more. It costs hugely more right now, unfortunately, unless something happens. I mean, our credit rating has already been affected a few times, but every country now has to pay a reasonable amount to borrow more. And I think a country which has problems with its trading profile, and which has also problems in terms of companies going and registering elsewhere and doing IPOs elsewhere, and the sort of issues that we're seeing right now in terms of where does how much actually the government still needs to step in to even ensure that we have a car industry in the UK, which was threatened and still being threatened despite the amounts of money that we're prepared to be putting into it. That gives us a serious problem in terms of the flexibility that might exist of any future government to do anything major in the economy.
Richard?
I agree very largely with what Vicky has said already in reaction to Max, and I liked the framing that Max used at the opening of his comments about the structure of society. But let's just come back to the fundamental point of why we face a particular problem in the UK, and that is that I spent 5 years as a professor of political economy before I took my current post, which appears to be a shift of disciplines, but frankly isn't really. And what do we talk about in political economy? It's about, well, moving power blocks and the importance of international relations with regard to the allocation of economic resources in this context. And we've quite clearly put ourselves outside the power blocks that are influencing where most resources are going. Brexit was unambiguously, in that sense, a disaster. We can't beat around the bush on this one. It was a mistake. It is time that was acknowledged, and a pathway towards addressing that problem is critical to any future of the UK economy, because without that pathway and without providing the stability that a clear relationship with the US and EU will provide, we aren't going to be securing the inward investment that is a necessary part of this process of building a sustainable economy, which we must do. We'll be on the sidelines taking whatever's left over. That's a disaster for a country like Britain, which, as Vicky said in one of her very earliest comments, we're an open economy. We can't afford to be an open economy where everything simply passes through and there is no substance to what is happening here. And that's the risk that we face.
Well, Richard, I know that what you're saying will be music to the ears of most liberal listeners to this podcast. Can we move on then to that, really the question of, well, okay, how do we pay for it all? Because this mantra we've had, which followed on, if you like, from there is no alternative in Tina, which is there is no money left. We can't afford any of this. I know that the focus of a lot of your work recently has been on challenging that kind of thinking.
Look, I was very annoyed early this summer when Lucy Powell MP, a member of the Shadow Cabinet, repeated Liam Byrne's comment from 2010, there is no money left. It was a pretty stupid comment by Liam. I have discussed it with him. He admits that it was meant to be a private joke. It clearly became a very public statement. It wasn't true, but that doesn't matter. The political damage was done. And it's as distressing to hear it being repeated by somebody who hopes to be in office in government within a year, because it's simply not true that there is no money left in the UK. This is a country where, according to the Office for National Statistics, and the last estimate was for 2021, there is 15.2 trillion pounds of private wealth. 15.2 trillion, 15,221 billion. You know, this is millions of millions, 15,221 million. Yeah, the number is enormous. Let's be blunt about it. And a lot of it, of course, is also in difficult forms of assets to access. Over 5 billion is in pension funds. Over 5 billion is in private property of various sorts. But actually, if you look at the structure of it, and I've done quite a lot of work looking at the structure of private wealth in the UK, around 80% of all assets are invested in some form of tax incentivized arrangement. Now, you can either include property in that, or you can exclude property from that. And curiously, you still come up with largely the same 80%-ish of figure. And a tax incentivized arrangement includes things like pension funds, it includes things like ISAs, and the amount of actual money that is held outside those is really quite small, about 1.6 trillion. It's quite remarkable how little money there is, which is not influenced by the tax system. So my thinking has revolved around three fundamental points. One is that we actually need to look at pensions and what they do again. Because I don't think the fundamental pension contract, that between generations, that one generation will create the capital, actually create the real physical capital, or intangible, but nonetheless intelligence to pass on to the next generation, because intangible capital does matter. But we aren't creating the capital to pass from one generation to next for the next generation to forego their income to keep us in old age. That is what I call the fundamental pension contract. And the current savings arrangements that we have for this pensions don't encourage that. They encourage short-term speculation, financial accumulation in what are a little short of Ponzi schemes in many cases, in my opinion. And we need to therefore question whether we should be changing the rules on pension funds. So one of my suggestions was that in exchange for tax relief, it would be entirely possible to argue that pensions should be required to invest 25% of all their new contributions. I'm not affecting those that have already happened, just their new contributions. But remember, new pension contributions are well over 100 billion a year, could go into investment in the economy. That would have funded the entire Green New Deal program that the Labour Party was talking about, but from which it has backtracked. Then there are ISAs, another arrangement which is entirely a subsidy to those with wealth in the UK. We now have ISA millionaires. Now, this was a system put in place in the 90s by the Tories and then adapted by Labour, which was intended to encourage small savers to put a bit aside by giving them a bit of a tax-free allowance. Instead, it's become basically a slush fund. Put in 20,000 at least a year, more for your children, and you can accumulate substantial tax-free sums outside the effective tax system, completely and utterly failing to provide any return, most of it held in cash. Cash held in bank accounts is dead money. It is withdrawn from circulation within the economy. It has no further effect on the multiplier effect that I noted earlier. It is effectively put aside, so it isn't generating further growth because it's not being spent. So could we instead change the whole ISA system and require that all the funds in ISAs effectively be used as the capital for a green wealth fund for the UK? The evidence is that actually the 700 billion pounds saved in ISAs at the moment, which is quite a staggering sum of money when you think about it, 700 billion is saved in ISAs. Over time, that money could all be reallocated to be a capital wealth fund. If you provided the guarantee of repayment, which is core to the saver, and provided the tax-free exemptions, I believe that most of that money would transfer. So I've looked at those two arrangements and said we can find capital funding, and we need to talk about it as capital, even as savings in the national capital. This isn't borrowing. This is money to be used for investment. The other fundamental problem we've got is, of course, the wealth distribution in the UK. The income distribution isn't great, but the wealth distribution is hideous, with very heavy concentrations in the top 20%, but really in the top 1 or 2% in most cases. This is anti-liberal in a very real sense, as Max has pointed out. I think it's quite clear that we have a problem here, which is destabilizing society. And so we need to look at whether we can collect more tax from them. I've been writing something called the Taxing Wealth Report. I have rejected the idea of a wealth tax because I think they're far too complicated to introduce, far too complicated to actually assess, will be open to vast numbers of appeals. After all, what is a racehorse worth? What is a work of art worth? What is a private company worth? But instead, let's look at whether we can tax the income from wealth a lot more. Capital gains are seriously undertaxed. If you just align the income tax rate with the capital gains tax rate done by Nigel Lawson, of course, at one time, we would collect another 12 billion a year. If we capped the tax rate at which relief was given for pension contributions, we could also collect another 12 billion a year. If we took off the VAT exemption for the financial services industry, which of course very largely services the wealthy, we could collect over 8 billion a year. If we took away capital gains tax entrepreneurs relief, which is a meaningless relief because it's given after the entrepreneur has exited the market rather than to encourage them to enter the market, we could pick up another 2+ billion a year. I can keep running through these things, but the point I'm making is that there are a great many changes within the tax system, and including to national insurance, which we could apply right across the income range rather than just at low levels. And we could also change many of the reliefs at lower level. I stress actually there should be a redistributive element in this. I think that part of the money raised should be used to reduce the tax burden on those on low incomes, particularly by reducing national insurance charges and potentially having a much broader early income tax band. But if we actually looked at this as a positive method of redistributing wealth from those who have it to those who might use it, live on it and spend it, and therefore stimulate growth, I think we'd be in a much better economic position. And that's the whole purpose of this. I'm not saying all of these things need to be done. I actually think I'm raising far too much money if I was to do that. That's not the point. What I really tried to lay out is a smorgasbord of options that if somebody says there is no money left, it was possible to say, but there is. You are making a positive choice not to do these things. Why are you doing that? Let's have a real debate about what the objectives are. And to simply dismiss the whole possibility of further government action by saying there's no money left is wrong. I'm trying to open up that opportunity for debate.
Vicky, your thoughts as our hard-headed economist here.
Well, of course, you can raise money by changing some of those areas that Richard has mentioned. Of course, also remember that the Labour Party has just announced that they intend to put VAT on private school fees and use that money in a sort of redistributive way, if you like. They also intend to end and tax non-DOMs. So that would also give them a little bit of extra money. But the sums are quite small. So the question is whether some of the areas that Richard has mentioned bring you more or not. But you could think back and look at what's been happening with fuel duty. Now, if that fuel duty had continued to rise with inflation, we would be having quite a lot of that money that you would like to have extra, Richard, already. Now, the question is, what would have happened to it and how would it have been used? So the real issue is whatever money you raise, whether that doesn't distort, if you like, a particular market, but also how you can use it to the best advantage. And if what we want is investment, then that's a big, big issue that needs to be looked at. The Conservative government at present is also, of course, talking about reforming pension funds and the insurance companies and the way in which they are allowed to invest to increase the possibility of them taking extra risk. Now, what Richard's idea was you sort of more or less guarantee that risk, possibly, I think, if I understood this correctly, so that risk is not that great. But there is always the concern that the way that we may be going about it, and it's happening also in Europe too, where some of these things are being looked at. You may find that there is indeed a bit of an issue about whether you can guarantee up the pensions of people in the future, and that concern, of course, has risen from recently from the fact that so much of what is being invested has gone into what was supposed to be safe government bonds, and of course loads of money is being lost on that right now, and the pension expectations of many nearing retirement is now being reduced quite significantly. So we have to put that against any proposals that encourage a lot more investment in areas which may go horribly wrong, like look at our infrastructure issues where prices are going up exponentially, and where the returns of those infrastructure projects may actually not be anything like as high as had been anticipated, unless, of course, you raise prices at the very end to consumers, as is probably going to be the case in loads of the areas that we are looking at now. But also, I think the Labour Party has talked about developing a wealth, a sovereign wealth fund of sorts. Yeah. So I think that takes on a little bit of what Richard had in mind. The question is always, from an economic viewpoint, making sure you spend it in the right way. And just thinking about HS2, I know that the Lib Dems are quite keen on this, but you would have been hard put to find an economist who was wholeheartedly in favor of HS2. I'm not just talking about the northern leg, I'm talking about HS2 overall, where the value for money was pretty, pretty sort of, they were all there was a lot of skepticism, if I can put it that way, about whether that project was at all justified, rather than doing something in terms of connecting the various cities in the north, or even improving what happens in the west and other areas where roads and train connections are awful.
And in all of this, and can we put some numbers on it? Because the amount that is needed to be spent from the government side, people talk about, is this of the order of 50, 60, 70 billion a year? I'm plucking figures out the air a bit. You've mentioned a few numbers, Richard. Do they get anywhere near that kind of a total?
Oh, I could raise more than that.
Let Richard loose and he can, yes.
I mean, at the moment, I can suggest changes which would raise 95 billion. I'm not suggesting you could do all of those at the same time. And in fact, actually, I mean, by the time I finish, the figure will be well over 100 billion. But I'm not suggesting they're all capable of being put in place at the same time. I'm not suggesting you necessarily need to fund all this investment out of current tax revenue either, let's be clear. Because in fact, some of it would obviously be appropriate to be borrowed, because it is for investment. And therefore, you actually would want to look at how you can, in a sense, re-educate people to the idea that actually lending money to the government is, first of all, saving. Secondly, the government is providing you with a banking facility by letting you put money there very safely. Over and above your 85,000, which is guaranteed in any other account, it's all guaranteed when lent to the government, because as a matter of fact, it is a selling point for NS&I. And third, that it will actually be hypothecated in a sense towards certain types of investment, which is quite successful with regard to NS&I's green bonds, for example, but they've been under-marketed. And the point that I want to, I'm saying is that actually, if we were innovative, we would think about the relationship between the real relationship between wealth and investment again. But in fact, what we have in our economy now is a relationship between savings and a return. But we don't actually link savings to investment. So the old economic idea that S equals I, which you can easily derive from some of the formulas in macroeconomics, is not true. We actually have savings which do not result in investment. They result in speculation. And what we really need to be doing is trying to rebuild this relationship between people's savings as a source of capital to fund investment. And that's the core inside some of my thinking. So I don't need to raise all this money by way of current tax. It's a very odd accounting notion to think that all investment should be funded out of current income. We can creatively use funds by creating, if you like, structures for this purpose. So we can have NHS savings funds, we can have Scottish, Welsh and Northern Ireland savings funds, we can have regional savings funds, we can have education savings funds. You hypothecated ISAs for these purposes if you so wish, but with the people committing their funds to this for a period of time. And what we know over the history of these investment programs is actually net withdrawals from ISAs have never really happened. It's always gone up and up and up. And therefore, we can pretty much rely on these as sources of capital. And that, to me, is what is fundamental, that the government balance sheet needs in itself to be reimagined so that there isn't a flipping great liability on its supposed balance sheet because it happens to have, in accounting terms, a credit next to it. Credit does not mean liability on a balance sheet. Credit can also mean equity or capital. And we've got to re-educate ourselves to think that the government's balance sheet can have this concept of national capital on it, to which people can contribute through their savings to therefore create investment. But Vicky's absolutely right. This does therefore have to be very clearly identified with particular investment schemes which are going to be agreed for the common good.
Well, one of them, of course, is, if you're thinking about a fund, hypothecated fund, for covering childcare costs and ensuring that sort of women can get back to work and they don't lose out, because that, of course, over a period of time has huge impacts on productivity. And over a period of time, as Richard was suggesting, you then collect a lot more tax and actually pays for itself. And the returns can be quite significant, I think, over a long period. But of course, the government tends to think very short term whenever it comes to sort of current spending, which is pretty wrong.
Again, this idea of capital, though, Vicky, I think is so important there. Pump priming capital to actually yield a long-term benefit, which is something which is just lost from our political economic narrative now, and which I would love to see restored to it. I think it's a massive contribution that all these types of debates should make, is how can we actually rethink that relationship?
I agree.
Max, as when you were sitting as the party's policy advisor, these must all have been topics that you put a lot of thought into. What would you like to add?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was really interested in and enjoying the discussion on wealth taxes. I mean, on a personal level, I agree with Richard that it's something we need to look at more seriously to raise revenue. And actually, when I was the party's advisor, one of the things that Vince and I wanted to do specifically was to come up with a more exciting and radical economic policy program for the party, given where it was and, you know, still is in terms of numbers of MPs and national visibility. And one of the areas we looked at was tax, both in terms of how you could raise more revenue for the government, but also do something that's progressive and that can address things like inequality. And, you know, just looking at, as Richard was saying, the fact that wealth inequality is higher and worse than income inequality in the UK, and the fact that it's relatively undertaxed made us go down the route of looking into wealth rather than income. And what we landed on in terms of policies was, rather than a kind of wealth tax, which, you know, you just kind of have a single tax on all assets, which I agree with Richard isn't very practical, because a lot of those assets are often quite illiquid and you can't necessarily tax them, you know, immediately. You know, we focused on existing taxes on capital, like capital gains and dividend taxes, but also inheritance, where, you know, at the moment, that type of wealth is taxed a lot less than income. So at the very least, we should be equalizing it. But there's potentially even an argument to tax them more than income, because you could argue, you know, someone working a full-time job, you know, compared to someone who's able to sit on assets and earn passive income, you know, there's more effort involved in earning an income. And so, you know, you might even want to tax wealth more. But in any case, we sort of had a set of proposals on that, which we thought were fair in terms of not treating different forms of effort differently in a tax system. We also thought they would raise a good amount of money. And also, I mean, I know wealth taxes are often portrayed as this kind of political nightmare, but actually, you know, we thought that they could be politically attractive if framed in the right way. So again, if you just talk about one wealth tax and you don't really explain what it is, I think that can cause people to panic. But if you explain that you want to basically make sure that however people are earning their money, you treat it the same way, and that you're going to use that for all the kinds of things that we need in the UK around public services and education, and that it will be proportionate. So, you know, people who are earning the most will pay more. I think people would understand that argument, but I think, you know, our politicians are scared to make those arguments. You see that with the Labour Party now, who, you know, previously Rachel Reeves was saying they were going to look into wealth taxes, and they're now dropping that ahead of the election. You know, the Lib Dems, unfortunately, even though that did become officially part of the policy program and we voted on it, or it was voted on at conference, we haven't really heard anything about taxing wealth since then. So I think there is a political, you know, nervousness here, but I think it's misguided, and I think we should be bolder on this issue. So
there are some areas here which are really easy to communicate about as well. For example, and you hinted at it, why is it that income from work does effectively attract an additional tax rate of 25% by the time you've taken the employers and the employees' national insurance together? Now, when I was a young chartered accountant, and I'm no longer a young chartered accountant, we're talking about in the early 80s here, then there was a thing called an investment income surcharge, an extra 15% tax on investment income to compensate basically for the fact there was no national insurance. That by itself, I reckon, could raise 18 billion a year. And it would be very hard for anyone to say, oh, these poor people sitting on an investment return shouldn't pay the same rate of tax as you who have to go out to work for a living. I mean, this is an easy political sell.
Well, with that challenge in mind, so how would you sell this to the apocryphal blue wall voter who are a favourite target of the Lib Dems?
I can start with a few thoughts.
Yes, please.
Well, I think firstly, if you look at public polling of British voters, and specifically of conservative voters or conservative leaning voters, what you actually see is they've become a lot more economically left wing over time, or interventionist, however you want to call it. Even though they are on let's say social issues, they are conservative when it comes to things like state intervention in the economy and so on. People are actually much more supportive of that in the past. So I think we should recognize that. And I think even when it comes to, let's say, the seats that the Lib Dems are targeting, which are often more affluent conservative voters, firstly, I think we should not just assume that people will always vote in their very narrow self-interest. I think a lot of people in the UK recognize that there are problems with the economy, that inequality is high, that we need more funding for lots of our public services. And so I think they realize that we can't just stick to the status quo. So I think there needs to be a willingness not to just to try and pander to this imaginary conservative voter who wants to kind of stick to how things are, but actually be willing to put arguments to them and try and convince them. And kind of as I was just saying, I think if you explain to people, that they might have to pay a little bit more tax, but also that they're not going to necessarily be the focus of what we're doing. When we're talking about rebalancing economic power, it's more about large corporations and about really the super rich, rather than people with, who are a little bit more affluent. I think explaining to them that the burden will be shared equally, and this isn't a sort of raid on the middle classes, I think is important. And yeah, I think ultimately, going back to what I was talking about as well, not just about the distribution of income and wealth, but also concentration in the economy. I think if we also made efforts to promote competition in the economy and reduce the hold of monopolies in tech and other areas, there'd be more opportunities for small businesses. Labor conditions would be better, and there'd be more investment that ultimately drives growth. So I think making all these arguments together, rather than just talking about tax or just talking about investment or so on, I think is the key.
Could I just add? Yes, of course one can make these arguments, but they are difficult to get them through. I mean, what people do know and must realize is, particularly looking at the sums that Richard hopes to raise over a period of time, won't happen immediately, as he said. I'm afraid the bulk of where the money comes from for the government is income tax and national insurance contributions. And I can't see how a lot of the aspirations of increasing investment, I mean, yes, you can play around with all these funds that are out there, pension funds and the ISAs and so on. And I do agree, with quite a lot of what Richard had in mind that may make a difference. But people must realize that for that investment to happen, income tax would have to go up. And that's where most of the extra cash can be generated. And I don't think that debate has been had at all. And I'm sure it's at the back of people's minds. And what Labour say would do if they come to power, at the end of the day, if the frustration is there and the economy is not recovering as fast as they would like it to do, in order to at least show that their debt to GDP ratio is falling, they're going to have to do something else if indeed their ambitions for investment are to be met. And I don't know how you can get around that type of discussion at the door. People are just trying to avoid it. So yes, you can explain all this and they can understand that perhaps indeed some of those taxes will go up, but at the back of everyone's mind will be, actually, is that going to be it, or are we also going to end up having to pay a lot more tax more generally in order to meet some of the needs that are there, and also for the redistribution, if you like, to take place? Because I agree with what Max was saying about the unequal society. It became a bit more unequal through COVID, and the interest rate increases that we've seen now have meant that those with properties are doing quite well if they don't have to remortgage. Those who have to remortgage or just mortgage to begin with are finding themselves excluded from a large part of their sort of well-being, if you like, and the investment they can make for the future.
But there is, I think, there's a pattern in what you're all saying, which is a shifting of the tax burden and shifting it from income more towards wealth, shifting it from primarily labor towards capital, shifting it from poor to rich. Looking the other way politically, how might we differentiate from Labour?
Well, it depends what Labour Party you're talking about, of course, and where Labour will be. At the moment, I don't think Labour's figures are adding up. I don't think they make any sense at all, bluntly. Vicky's referred to the 5 odd billion that they say they're going to raise from a couple of changes to the tax system. The 1.6 billion from schools is likely. I'm not convinced that 3+ billion from the change in the domicile rule is. And I sat on Treasury committees on this issue quite a lot at various periods between 2007 and about 2012. So it's an area which I've been around for some time for both Labour and the Tories, I'll make clear. So I'm not convinced of the yield from that one. They are being incredibly timid. They are being overly optimistic with regard to the promises they're making for what is a tiny amount of money. I mean, we're talking about 5 billion at best out of total government spending of over 800 billion. And I hear Darren Jones, Shadow Chief Secretary of the Treasury, saying that 5 billion is a lot of money. Yes, it is in terms of personal wealth. In terms of government spending, it's a drop in the ocean. So Labour has, at the moment, begun to make promises. And I think that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves in particular, but let's be honest, Angela Rayner as well, have had good weeks at their conference. And I'm sure they're feeling cock-a-hoop about that. But the reality is that they've got another year to go before they're likely to face an election. I suspect the election is next October. And if that's true, they've got to maintain this myth that all these promises can be fulfilled without any more money. And I was a little surprised that on the day we're recording this, which obviously is not the day most people will be watching this, but I happened to note somebody called Ed Balls on GMB saying about Labour, rather cynically, new towns, 300,000 new social houses a year, and there's no government funding being provided. No, that doesn't work. And for once, I had to agree with Ed.
Okay, hang on. New towns, we did say before that whatever investment there may need to be needs to be sensibly looked at in terms of value for money. New towns are a disaster, as are, if I may say to those who are listening or will be listening, trams. Any of those promises, trams are at the bottom of the value for money calculation that the Department for Transport does. At least it used to be. So you have to be very, very careful what you wish for. And I think, to be fair though, on Labour, it wasn't 300,000 affordable homes. No, it was, I think it was 180 or something, 100 and something affordable homes a year. They had reduced that to. Or was that actually the Lib Dems? That was the Lib Dems. I do apologise. That makes a lot more sense.
But if it's 100,000 social houses a year, it's still going to cost, broadly speaking, if they're of a reasonable size, over 20 billion a year for that commitment alone. Now, that is not going to be covered by the sources of funding they're talking about. So if we're comparing with Labour at the moment, the point to simply make is, how do your figures add up? Because they say they're going to be fully costed. I'm a chartered accountant, an economist. I look at these things in the macro sense, but using those skills. And I certainly cannot make those equations balance right now. There simply isn't a financing mix that they have put together that shows how they're going to do it. They're being incredibly optimistic about increasing tax yields from fiscal drag, i.e. fixed allowances and reliefs, which they're presumably going to carry over from the Tories, which they promise won't increase till 2027. And we know that increases revenues. But overall, no, they just can't actually achieve these goals from what they're saying. So Labour at the moment is out in the dark, and I think there's an opportunity to challenge them by saying, okay, good promises, now tell us the truth about the funding arrangements. Is there more tax, or is there more borrowing? What is it? And what are you going to do with interest rates? Because I think that one is particularly important as well, because let's be blunt, the Bank of England does listen to Chancellors of the Exchequer. They have no choice. Read Section 19 of the Bank of England Act 1998, and it says a Chancellor can overrule the Bank of England whenever they basically wish. So, of course, Chancellors have a significant influence, and we're not hearing them saying anything about their future desired direction of interest rates either.
I think that's probably a good concluding point in there, saying whatever proposals one comes up with, we need to have a well thought through plan for how they are going to be funded. And even though the sums that we need to find are large, the sums that are available with much more imaginative approaches to state funding and come to that private sector funding, the sums are available. But it does need a very different economic narrative to the one we've got at the moment. We can see it being done elsewhere, and there are clues in what we're seeing coming across in the States. We just need a government that's got the belief and the commitment to do it. But that does need parties like the Lib Dems to be challenging the existing narratives. So if I could bring things to a close there, thank you very much, Vicky, Max and Richard. Thanks very much for your contributions. We'll bring it whole to it there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.